We are the global shapers of the Budapest Hub, a network of young people driving dialogue, action, and change. Welcome to our Shaping Budapest podcast series, where we aim to tackle various global issues in a local context. In each podcast episode, together with our guest speakers, experts, and thought leaders, we will explore one of the following topics: climate and environmental change, sustainable business, fourth industrial revolution, and the need of a new social contract. We hope to get you engaged and inspired to think global and act local.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our podcast for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, organized by the Budapest Hub of the Global Shapers Program. My name is Juan Daniel Gonçalves, a Budapest Hub member, and I'm the host for this podcast. And joining us, we have economists Antonio Bravo, Rafael Velazquez, and Adolfo
Smith.
Lima. I'm sorry,
Smith,
Antonio
Bravo.
Smith. I used the second last name. So, welcome, everyone. We will be first doing some very brief intros of each of our panelists, and then I will do a brief intro of the topic as well, and then I'll invite our panelists to talk about what they consider to be their area of focus or expertise, and then we will have a very lively discussion about these topics. So first of all, I want to start with Adolfo. Adolfo is an economist and senior analyst at Venn Analytics, a research firm dedicated to macro and political environment analysis in Venezuela. Adolfo is currently based in Caracas. He graduated from the Central University of Venezuela with a bachelor's degree in economics, as well as a master's degree in finance from IESA, which is Venezuela's top management school. And Adolfo is also a former political activist, a role which is giving him particular insight and interest in public matters, as well as the future of society. And last but not least, he is a member of Lidera, which is Venezuela's top youth leadership network. So welcome, Adolfo. Thank you for being on board. Next, we have Antonio
Thank
Smith.
you, Juan, for the invitation.
Thank you. Next, we have Antonio Smith. Antonio is joining us from Budapest, where I'm located as well. Antonio completed his undergraduate studies in economics at the Catholic University of Venezuela in Caracas, Andres Bello Catholic University. He also completed a master's in economics and finance at CENFI in Spain, as well as a master of public policy at the Hertie School of Governance in Germany. He's currently pursuing a PhD in political science, specialized in political economics at the Central European University in Budapest, and his research focuses on the political economy of oil-rich states. Then we have Rafael Velazquez. Rafael is joining us from Miami. He's the CIO for Mango Capital, a global macro hedge fund, and he's the principal at AlgoDepth, a Boston-based startup focused on the application of machine learning techniques with regards to financial data. Rafael graduated from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. as a political economist. And then last but not least, I'll say a few words about myself, the host for this podcast. As I said, I'm a shaper of the Budapest Hub, now living in Hungary for almost 3 years. I am passionate about fascinating topics such as the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and anything that's about how human society is evolving, and what fascinating discussion we can have related to where we're headed as a civilization. I'm also a partner at a market research and data analytics company here in Hungary called DTAG Analytics. And beyond DTAG, I am also the founder of Quinta da Saraiva, which is a rural boutique sustainable hotel inaugurated in Madeira in 2019. And I also studied at Georgetown University. I graduated as an international political economist. Well, that said, we will be talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution alongside four main areas: business, government, civil society, and education. I'll just say a few words introducing the topic, and then I'll invite the panelists to give their thoughts on the matter after we tell our audience what it is exactly what do we mean by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So we know we've heard of the first, we've heard of the second, we've heard of the third, but what is this fourth industrial revolution? And it was actually the main theme at the 2016 Davos conference organized by the World Economic Forum. And as mentioned during the conference by the chairman of the World Economic Foundation, Klaus Schwab, it is up to us leaders and citizens to shape together a future that works for all of us by putting people first and empowering them to constantly remind ourselves that all of these new technologies that we have today are first and foremost tools made by the people for the people. So we know that the first industrial revolution used water and steam power to mechanize production, originating in England. And then the second revolution used electric power to lead us towards mass production. And the third used electronics and information technology to automate production. And now we find ourselves in a stage where there's this fusion of technologies that's blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological worlds. The exponential increase in technology development, best shown by Moore's law, since the invention of transistors, this exponential J-curve growth of how we're able to process much more data with a far lower cost with each passing year, has opened the door towards many fascinating applications and possibilities that were just sci-fi 20, 30, 40 years ago. I like to talk about the singularity a lot. I like to think about how our smartphones in our pockets right now have more computing power than all of mission control had in Houston when they put man on the moon in 1969 for Apollo 11. And it's really the fourth industrial revolution is the next stage in human evolution. I'm really curious about what it is that we will discuss with our panelists about how they see that technology and data will change the way we live and interact with regards to our social lives, our families, our careers, health, government, business, security, and more. So with that said, I invite our panelists to share their thoughts. I will start by asking Antonio about his thoughts on the fourth industrial revolution. Antonio mentioned that he was particularly interested in how the fourth industrial revolution would affect labor policy, political incentives to implement universal basic income, the decline of organized labor, biological inequalities arising due to genetic modification, quite a few points. So Antonio, please go ahead, tell us what you think, and then I invite Rafael and Adolfo to interject if they believe they have any other interesting points to add to the conversation. So the floor is all yours.
Okay. What I'm concerned about is the fact that we will most likely observe a much more capital-intensive economy, where many processes will be automatized, and most likely this will mean that many occupations that today require the employment of humans will be automatized, and this would lead to a larger labor capital inequality. And the question is, what political consequences would this have? Because if we live in a world in which processes are constantly being automatized, this means that the incentive to organize, to have organized labor as we know today will be lower, because if you know that your profession will most likely be automatized and your job is not going to be available as we know it today in 20 or 30 years, then this will mean that labor power in politics will decrease. And
well, what if you shift to different work? I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be bad. You just
yes, exactly.
You move labor towards higher added value jobs.
Correct. that's what I wanted to that's what I wanted to emphasize, that this period of transition, since it will be a world of instability, this period of transition from jumping from one job to another job will require new state interventions. And this is one of the justifications in favor of universal basic income, just to smooth out this transition period. Otherwise, this can have, we can observe political instability.
So you're saying without
processes.
But you're saying without UBI, we won't be able to shift our labor into higher added value jobs, new jobs. Without UBI,
No,
there's no chance to adapt to the next world.
You can adapt, but it will be you will have negative impacts on mental health and and on welfare in the transitions. I don't think the transition is going to be. Swift transitions are good for, let's say, mental health, and it can have negative effects on the welfare of people. So this is why there will be pressures to use alternative forms of income to help workers switch to other jobs in the transition period.
I'm curious what Rafael would think, because I know Rafael tends to be a little bit more on the libertarian side and minimizing the role of government. So I'm curious what Rafael's stance is in the shifting of the labor force to adapt to jobs that will become obsolete, and whether there's any way to do it without relying on the government or principles such as UBI. What do you think, Rafael?
I mean, it's a question of, it's similar to, I don't think this is anything new, right? This has happened, time and time and time again across history. It's just a question of, well, what is the best way to deal with this, right? And, if you go back to the Washington Consensus, increasing globalization, all these types of things, I think there was an argument by economists that saying, oh, increasing globalization, even though, there's going to be a loss in income at home, for certain types of people in manufacturing jobs, it's going to be compensated for by, increased specialization, different competitive advantages for different countries. But the problem was that, if you take this aggregate, you basically don't see what's happening underneath that, which is, yeah, sure, at that total level, it's an improvement, but there's definitely a composition effect where some people are getting disproportionately harmed, right? And the question is, well, what can you do about that, right? Is there a role for the government to successfully, improve those outcomes, right? It's not necessarily about preventing the change, but how can you prevent the change while minimizing the costs for a certain group of people? And, UBI is one possibility, right? But, I think UBI, you can argue for it for many different reasons. I wouldn't necessarily think that retraining is a reason for UBI. And, I think there are, you can make more targeted programs that might be, more useful for making that transition, to sort of, reducing that impact on people who need to be retrained. For example, you can have a online program where people can be, retrained in, for example, learning data science, which are high in demand jobs. That is, that's one example of something where, the government can encourage those types of projects, but it's, it's not necessarily UBI is a solution there. It's more about how do you equip people for this next stage of the economy.
Fair enough. Well, I will give Antonio the chance to either agree or refute that point, but I'm curious, Adolfo, is there anything you want to add as well to the conversation?
Yeah. I'm a bit concerned with inequality in this situation. And what I mean is some governments will be able to both identify and either through universal basic income or through more focalized subsidy programs solve or at least mitigate these problems. But the issue I am seeing is that not every government will be able to do this. And the thing with technology is that it basically spreads towards the rest of the world from its origin towards the rest of the world, and we're going to have countries with much less capacity to respond to these evolving technologies. So I would at least question how the world would be prepared to engage these problems, and how they for example, through I don't know, improved programs in international financial institutions such as the IMF, or better yet, the World Bank, which would be better equipped to deal with these situations. But in the end, my issue is that, I mean, this ideal, the scenarios we're talking about, they're good for governments that are well equipped to deal with these situations, but I don't think the entire world is prepared to face such a revolution.
Well, you're absolutely right, and you can't equally distribute governments that might be able to subsidize or support upskilling in across all of the world. My question is, and maybe this is a question for Antonio since it's his topic.
Okay.
I'm curious, Antonio. Even despite the fourth industrial revolution and machines making many people's jobs obsolete, will there still be a need for cheap labor, for cheap human labor, despite how much we would be able to advance and automate and scale with machines? What do you think?
That's
it's a tough one.
hard to it's a very hard to answer question, because if we assume that monotonous jobs which employ a large amount of workers today are the first that are going to be automatized, perhaps that will be a problem. Perhaps you could find large sectors of societies that are not employable in the 21st century.
So what do you do with traditionally?
So this will.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
So that this is one of the reasons in favor of universal basic income, because perhaps many people won't have the capacity to be retrained.
Well, that's what
think
Adolfo
about the elderly.
Adolfo is saying not every country will have the ability to give UPI. I mean, let's think about, say, Bangladesh, which is a country that traditionally, specializes in low added value goods that are manufactured for export. Mm-hmm. Does Bangladesh have really the capacity to develop a UBI program that could help its population, with a scenario where they might become obsolete when they're mostly competitive in low cost manufacturing? I mean, is it possible? What will Bangladesh do in 10 years and 15 years from now?
Yeah, very hard.
Does anybody want to save, Antonio?
No, it's not safe. It's like I cannot predict the future of this. I cannot predict the future of textiles, no. But I'm saying that anyways, inequalities between these, I guess, the gap between these sectors, these labor-intensive sectors as textiles, and the new 21st century high-tech jobs is going to increase, most likely. So that will contribute to an increase in inequality. But I'm not sure if also textile manufacturing will be automatized, and therefore Bangladesh workers will lose their jobs. Very hard to tell. I'm not sure if I don't think anyone can predict that. Yeah, what would happen in this case? Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to make a brief side note. Unfortunately, Georgetown University's account, which I'm using, is on a free Zoom plan. So the meeting will end in 9 minutes. I will have to reschedule it. So there might be a weird cut in the middle, but don't worry, we'll try to edit it out as best as possible. But what do you guys think, Rafael and Adolfo? Are the Bangladeshis or the Vietnams of this world scheduled or destined to fail with the fourth industrial revolution? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel with these countries that are at risk of losing the workforce to automatized solutions? What would you do if you were the prime minister of these countries?
I wouldn't talk about such an apocalyptic scenario that those countries are just going to disappear, or a lot of people are going to die, or some disaster is going to happen. What I think it could happen is that in the worst case scenario, they're going to be hit hard as economies, and they're going to be forced to somehow recalibrate or reconfigure themselves. That's going to happen both through market forces and through political government intervention, depending on what's happening with the government and the national politics of those specific countries by the moment. But I also I want to insist on the role of international financial institutions and how they serve as sort of not wealth transfer agents, but agents, liquidity transfer agents who could in some way help these countries affront these upcoming crises. In the end, what we should expect that'll happen is that whether they are prepared or not, this revolution is going to happen, and they will have to face it whether they are prepared or not. And if they're prepared, they're not going to be hit as hard as if they are as if they are not prepared. But in the end, and especially because most of these in general, any economy needs a lot of time to adapt and does not have that capacity of looking into 30, 40, 50 years in the future, or 10 or even 10 years in the future. My perception is that the impact will be negative. That is, those countries will not be entirely prepared, and they will have to face those problems, let's say, without much preparation. But even then, I think there will be institutions and, institutions, especially international institutions, that will allow for those hits, those shocks, not to be that destructive.
So if I understand your way or your recommendation to prepare is start knocking on the doors of Washington, of the World Bank and the IMF, saying, hey guys, we know this is coming. We need help. This is how we suggest you can help us by upskilling our labor force. This is a very detailed plan, and it will pay off because we will be generating this much more added value. Maybe it could be framed in terms of just asking for a subsidy as a loan that could be paid back from the benefit of having a better labor force. Did I understand that correctly, Adolfo?
Well, that's not the issue entirely. I mean, that's an important part, but in the end, what matters the most is that these countries are prepared, and that preparation does not only include going towards international financial institutions, but it also includes simply understanding that the world is going to change and trying to assess where it is going to change to create structures, both political and market structures. That's much harder, but creating structures that allow for flexibility, policies that will help in improving and securing that flexibility. In the end, what I mean is those countries have to be prepared. That'd be my suggestion. How you're going to prepare that, it depends entirely on what your vision of the future is, how you expect that impact to come upon you as a country, and of course what you will need to be prepared and to confront those problems, which is highly specific to each country. I cannot make a more specific prediction or I can be more specific. I don't think I can be more specific on how they have to adapt, because that depends entirely on how those economies are configured.
That's a very fair point. I mean, nobody will hold you liable for what you're saying. Don't worry. You're free to speak your mind. So disclaimer, we'll put a banner in the bottom saying, please don't take this advice literally. Don't sue us. Yes. So that's very fair. Thank you, Adolfo. We still have 4 minutes before we have to do our technical stop to reschedule the meeting. I'm just curious if Rafael, perhaps before moving on to another topic, there's something you want to add related to what we're saying?
Yeah, I think I have a pretty idiosyncratic view on this, and I'll say it sort of sarcastically, but I think the solution to the problem that we're talking about was COVID-19. And
it was the purge, the cleansing purge of inefficiencies. The strong would survive. Social Darwinism, yes.
Not necessarily in the way you're saying.
From the economic perspective, at least. Sorry, not from the person perspective.
No, I mean, for example, when we talked about, the third industrial revolution was, huge globalization where manufacturing jobs got moved from, the most developed countries in the world to less developed countries in the world where labor costs were
it's all
substantially
about supply
lower.
chains. All right. About supply chains, yes.
It's all about supply chains. But now we're moving, basically the world is moving in the opposite direction. Optimization technologies are doing a lot better. So it's, you need less labor to produce things inside of, a developed country with a very high wage level. Wage levels in these developing countries, because of this has increased a lot, right? Paying for, an hour of labor in China is a lot more expensive than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And increasingly that, the distrust of people towards globalization, where they will now prefer to have their supply chains in-house, or at least in a country close to them that they trust. That's going to, I think, cause a huge move, and we saw it with COVID-19, right? Countries realized that all of these very important medical supplies were produced mostly in China, and they had a hell of a time, procuring the supplies they needed to keep their people safe, their hospitals safe. And a lot of countries will say, we can't let this happen again. We need to bring all of this in-house. So you're going to see a huge shift of that supply chain in-house. That's going to shift those jobs away from, sort of these developing countries. But the flip side is that at the same time, when everyone's been working from home, and, basically a lot of people have found that it's been surprisingly efficient, a lot better than they would have expected, just given their experience and, a whole life of, working in an office with everyone there. That is going to lead to basically a huge increase in manufacturing jobs in, sort of developed countries. But I think a large increase in white collar office jobs in less developed countries, because, today, the cost of a computer is, $100, and, internet connections is pretty cheap. So, there's no need to hire someone to do some, relatively menial Excel task or Word task or these types of things in the United States, where you have to pay them a United States salary, where you can hire someone who can do the equivalent job in one of these other countries, because now you're used to working from home and it works, and you figure it out how to incorporate that into your processes. So, maybe, this is going to happen over time, over the process over decades, and maybe, you're not going to go out and fire Juan Gonçalves and hire someone in Sri Lanka, for example, we were talking about. But maybe when Juan Gonçalves decides that he wants to leave his current job and go somewhere else, instead of finding someone else in Budapest to hire, you will basically look for someone in Sri Lanka, which you can probably hire for a lower wage and can do the job just as well as one did. So I think that's where a lot of this is going, and the impact is going to be interesting, not just in that transition, but in relative wages within developed countries, where the past 30 years, where white collar workers doing a lot better than. I think you're underestimating the how global the internet and access to, maybe not necessarily computers, but smartphones and all these things are throughout the world. I can assure you that you go to anyone in most developing countries, and they're going to know what WhatsApp is. They're going to know how to use all of these different tools, right? From there to learning to using a computer, sending an email, doing some Word or Excel work. I don't think that's particularly challenging, right? It can be somewhat condescending to think that you can that manual labor is something that's very easy, whereas knowledge labor is very difficult. I think in many cases might be the opposite, right? A lot of this labor that needs to be done in factories is complicated, right? The thing is that, well, it's relatively low value, and so you can you outsource it to these places, but these people have to learn how to do these things, and companies develop processes to teach them. I mean, I don't see why the same can't be true about using anything from the office suite, sending emails. I think it's a lot easier to retrain people for the type of knowledge work a lot of people do in office than people think.
I think that's a completely fair point. Just my issue here would be sort of the time it would take to retrain, people to learn these skills. They're not unlearnable. It's not rocket science to know how to send an email or do some basic Excel formulas. You're absolutely right. But these are things that you still have to train and still have to learn. And that takes time and investment. And we're talking about millions of people that are going to be affected within the next 5 to 10 years when push comes to shove, and automating most manual process and supply chains are going to come into full effect. But you're right. I mean, it's humans are capable of adapting and surviving. That's her core instinct. I agree. It's just I do believe that there has to be, I think Adolfo was talking about it, about how governments need to start thinking about this as a real threat and have the right policies and have the right partners in international financing institutions to enact these plans that would help with the transition or shift in labor competencies. And now that, I think unless, Antonio, is there anything else you want to say about this? I mean,
this is part of the reasons in favor of compensatory income, because most likely during the process of retraining, you need to survive, and you need to, yes, of course, you need to focus on training to scale or to transition to other job. And this is one of the reasons in favor of universal basic income or alternative social programs. In addition, higher education would also change. Perhaps we will have demands for higher education during, I don't know, a continuous higher education, a continuous training, most likely, because if you assume that that you need to be retrained every certain years because of the technological progress, it's not enough to have completed only a bachelor's degree or a technical degree, but you will need to be constantly training because of to keep the pace with technological process. So higher education will also change, and there will be demands also for governments to intervene and provide a continuous training programs, for example.
Fair point.
And sources of income, yes.
Now that we were in the concept also of globalization and supply chains, I'm curious, Rafael, you mentioned earlier that you wanted to say some points about how increasing trade barriers plus the new global paradigm of working from home will affect relative income distribution in developed countries. And I think it kind of relates, so we can build off from what we were saying earlier. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and then let's see how our panel will react to how you think about this topic.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a little bit what I talked, already, just from the other side, right, of where the jobs are leaving to. And I think what it's is that there's going to be interesting societal dynamics to where the jobs are going, right? Obviously, the past 30, 40 years, for example, in the United States, you've seen, a lot of manufacturing businesses close down, and those jobs, move to other countries, whether it's Mexico or China or India or different places. And knowledge workers have, basically their relative income to white collar work has, substantially increased. And it's led to a lot of issues in the country, right? Like for example, the opioid epidemic and all of these sorts of things. And what's interesting, it's obviously something that takes multi-decades, is that I think that the opposite is going to be true, because of what I mentioned before, that anti-globalization leads to manual labor coming back, whereas work from home leads to knowledge work leaving. And so, an increase in inequality over the past, several decades. But, the interesting thing, and basically what government can do to fix it, but the interesting thing might be that basically the thing that's going to have the largest impact on that over the next decades, it's not going to be any government policy, but basically just the realization of people on how work from home can work efficiently rather than being in an office, brought about by the quarantines from COVID-19. Like anything, it's hard to predict how exactly it's going to happen, but I do think it will. There will be large differences from that people. I think it's very underappreciated. I don't think anyone has really thought too much about how all of these knowledge jobs are going to leave, but I do think that's going to happen. And another one is when I'm talking about education, right? Obviously right now a lot of education has moved onto Zoom. Many universities and
Zoom University, yeah,
universities
$1,000 a semester for Harvard online classes, yeah.
Right. Many universities and schools are deciding, based on the COVID dynamics of their specific geography, whether it's safe to have live classes or not, or whether you have to do them online. And what's interesting, and this is already going on in some places for different reasons, but for example, in South Korea, you have many teachers who are basically celebrity teachers, and they teach courses online of these types of things, and they make a lot of money, like if they were a musician or an actor, because people are very interested in education. So if you're going to listen to a Zoom class, why would you listen to a Zoom class from Miss Sally from Nebraska when you can listen to the best professor in mathematics to showing kids how to do addition or multiplication and subtraction? It's going to be a video at the end of the day. Basically it's going to go where education goes from being something local to being something very global. Just before before you had recorded music and music players and all these things, each town would have its own singers that would sing the music and play the music of that place. And then when you had
but do you think this is a COVID phenomenon or a future global trend we're heading towards? Because we're talking about the future here, right?
I think it's a future global trend, but I think it's definitely sort of sped up by COVID. And I don't know if it would have happened without it, but I think it's definitely going to go there, and we're going to get there a lot faster than we would have otherwise.
Okay, I see. Adolfo, I can't see your face. I know Antonio has been making a lot of facial expressions, for which I will take screenshots later to share with them. But anything you want to add, Adolfo?
Well, actually, I was wondering, this movement from office to working at home has led some companies to stations or making their workers stay at home, but not necessarily led them to take that decision, but has led them to consider this decision. And once it is taken, I'm wondering what effect it will have in salaries, given that working from home essentially transfers costs of operating offices to workers. That is, the soap I used in my office, now I have to pay for. The paper I used in my office, or office materials I used in the office, now I will have to use in my home, and I will have to procure for my house. So there's a lot of costs that are now being transferred to the worker. And probably more of a future projection I can make that how this will affect salaries and how this will affect in general worker compensation packages.
I'll tell you. You see it. Google already and some other Silicon Valley giants have started saying that they will pay their employees based on their city where they're based. And this is the thing that's happening now. Salaries will be adjusted to the average cost of living or purchasing power, conditions for the Midwest, for Florida. No longer will people who earned, San Francisco salary, a Mountain View salary, a Silicon Valley salary, will be earning the same working from home, in wherever, in Kansas. And that's what's happening. That's what these big companies are doing. And I hope, that answers your question. I think it's fair.
I actually don't think that's what's going to happen, right?
But it's happening. But
for a different reason. What they're talking about is adjusting their salaries for their current employees that, for example, living in some place expensive. And then if they decided to move, it's basically a way to somewhere that's cheaper. It's a way for them to basically take money back. But I think what's probably more likely to happen is that salaries are going to become more uniform, and cost of living between different cities is going to, basically the relative values of cost of living between different cities is going to decrease from a large amount. Like, obviously, there are cities that are more desirable geographies because they have better weather, they have cultural institutions, better food, et cetera, et cetera. But currently, a large premium in the cost of living in cities is the quality of the job market, right? San Francisco wouldn't be as expensive as San Francisco is if you didn't have, extremely profitable, gigantic tech companies able to pay very, very high salaries. If that were the case, maybe, throwing a number out there, maybe the difference between living in San Francisco and living in Minnesota is, a 50% increase. And maybe if salaries weren't that high, just because San Francisco has more desirable weather than Minnesota, the difference should be 15% or 20%. And what you might see over the next couple of decades is a shrinking of that relative difference, because now people don't have to go to San Francisco for for the good jobs. And what you'll see, one of the places where that is going to really show up is in the cost of real estate, right? In a way, existing, legacy homeowners of real estate in San Francisco have been one of the largest beneficiaries of, the incredible success of tech companies, where, the profit, the revenues generated by these companies, which then gets passed to their employees as, a salary, basically gets passed at the end of the day to landlords in San Francisco. And, then be making these huge amounts of money, these windfalls that they never expected.
There's network effects, yes.
And that's going to revert. And you're already seeing that, right? People saying, rents in San Francisco are already down, 8, 9, 10, 12% from what they were a year ago, and it's only been 3 or 4 months. What if this becomes something more permanent? When, 3 or 4 months, you can think about it, say maybe the first month people wouldn't have moved, but there's only been 2 or 3 months really where people's leases have become expired and they've been able to renegotiate their leases. As you get into a full cycle of that, you're going to see larger and faster drops in the cost of rent, housing, et cetera.
Well, true, but we're talking about things in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, meaning what's going to be the new normal moving forward. And I understand that this somehow, has been sort of the consequence of COVID. But in terms of data and in terms of what we're able to achieve today, I guess this is also, enabled, this massive work from home phenomenon is enabled by the fourth industrial revolution itself, by the ability of having people access high-speed internet connections with affordable devices and very, very stable connections that can allow that can allow this sort of arrangement where you don't depend on being in the office as you would before, during the first, second, or third industrial revolution. Now, my question is that I want to pose all of you is, yes, we are living in the COVID world or post-COVID world in some places, but in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, is a decentralization of the office, is the decentralization of work really the future that we should expect, enabled by by the internet and the ability to process data that we can have today. What do you think? Is this here to stay, or is it just something that's going to last for a year? And I want to ask Antonio, because I see him nodding a lot. So.
Yeah, I think that's here to stay, and we will go even further. So basically, we will have also problems, especially in developed countries, since many of the jobs, as we already talked about, will be transferred to developing countries. Since you will be able to work in the US from a developing country. So you won't need a visa anymore to have a US job, for example. You won't need a labor visa, a working visa to work in the US. So that will create problems, and perhaps that will cause political instability or trouble in developed countries, since many of these jobs will be outsourced to developing countries. And yes, that will. You were saying that you expect to observe a compression of wages between the main U.S. cities and the countryside. Now you can extend it further, and you can expect expect a compression of wages between the U.S. and other developing countries, because so you will see this.
That's very
now you don't need to make a wall to stop illegal immigration in the U.S. because you can have the job, you can have the same job in a developing country.
Fair point. Let's try to keep as impartial as possible on politics. Well, that's a fair point.
Yeah, I know, but that's a point, that you don't need physical barriers anymore to do these jobs.
It is a very good point, and agreed. And then to wrap up the conversation, I want to ask Adolfo, since he wanted to talk about the role of government with regards to the fourth industrial revolution. What specifically, Adolfo, are you interested in, or are you passionate about, or are you worried about with governments, looking down 5 years from now, 10 years from now, with the new normal of the world? And with that, I suggest we use this as a closing topic for now, for this edition. We'll do a brief summary at the end, and Yeah, let's see what government should do or shouldn't do.
Well, I was trying to find a way of approaching this issue generally, because of course technology has many ways of impacting any area of life, and personal situation. What I want to talk about is innovation in the public sector, which in general, when we talk about innovation and the public sector, we think about the public sector fostering innovation in the private sector, or in some way not interfering so that the private sector can innovate as much as it can. And this is, of course, an important role of the public sector, which we cannot leave aside, but an important issue.
Uh-oh, I think we lost Adolfo. Just as a side note, Adolfo is currently in Venezuela, which is which has the worst average internet connection speeds in the whole Western Hemisphere. So yes, countries of the world listening, please invest in your telecoms infrastructure. It's important. If not, you will miss out on the fourth industrial revolution. So Adolfo, do we have you again on the line?
Yeah, I'm back.
Welcome back from the dead. Please carry on.
So we have this view of innovation that just leads innovation to the patient that does not happen as much or isn't that important, and it's often related to improved policies or essentially revolutions in the ideological spectrum, that is improving or changing, considerably changing the way a country works, for example. That's a view of innovation, top-down view, that's what it's called, and it's related to how leaders within government shape policy and shape, government in general, and have a deep impact on how a country develops, or how our country develops. But there's not only top-down innovation, there is also base-up, and those elements are not have not been a subject of study or world curiosity up until the last few 10, 20 years. And how this technology, and the fact of the matter with this is how we incorporate new technologies, and how the government deals with new technologies, for example, through regulatory issues, through the shaping, the creation of policies, through the improvement of public sector processes, and, well, of course, as I had said, through regulation. And all of this, I think, has, because of how the public sector is shaped, has many obstacles and many challenges, specifically because electoral dynamics are much different from market dynamics, which leads to much less competition, or a lagged competition with respect to the private sector. The fact that there is rigid vigilance with respect to the use of resources, so that to, for example, offer a bonus to an employee for having done something innovative is a hard thing. I mean, it's unless you're in Finland, or you're in the United Arab Emirates, where they're trying to change this view on how bureaucracy shapes policy and how bureaucracy innovates in the government. You're not going to see this kinds of employee benefits related to bureaucracy. So in the end, there are many challenges that the public sector faces when it's aiming at adopting new technologies, changing the way it does things, and that essentially leaves it lagged with respect to the private sector. And I think that's something that a very little part of the world is dealing with, but the rest of the world is simply not seeing this problem, or not including
Uh-oh.
within their public management agenda.
Well, we couldn't hear the last 10 seconds, Adolfo, but if you allow me, at the risk of misconstruing and completely butchering your line of thought, I will try to then, if I would have to put this into one sentence, I would say that perhaps your point is, and please interject if I'm wrong, I would have to say that you're arguing that it's not enough to have the fourth industrial revolution happening around us, but it's also even perhaps more important or more necessary to have the right leaders that could harness and implement the opportunities that are made available now in our world, both from the public and the private sector. Is that
no? Actually, that's not quite it. What I think there's two elements to what my argument. The first one is that there are issues that are structurally related to government, which make innovation hard, or make innovating in the public sector hard. That is, for example, how electoral dynamics behave, which shape electoral competition, and how people in government would want to innovate. There's also rigid vigilance, that is the possibility that of instilling innovation requires to go through that those who push for innovation go through a series of rigid institutions. And aside from these difficulties for innovation in the public sector, which are structural, there is one that can be changed and is being changed by by some part of the world, and should spread on upcoming years to the rest of the governments in the world. And that is that we tend to view public sector innovation as something that does not exist, or that is not relevant, or should not, or we don't even think about it. And we should be fostering innovation within the public sector. That's something that's not being given enough relevance.
Understood. I'm just taking down some notes for a summary at the end. Well, we just got the reminder of doom that our free recording will end in 10 minutes. So that's what we have left. So perhaps we'll leave 5 minutes towards the end for the summary. Rafael or Antonio, any of you want to comment on what Adolfo just said for the next 5 minutes? Well, I think we can agree. I mean, it is hard to innovate in the public sector. Yes, there are constraints with regards to rigid institutions and lack of rewarding incentives for individual agents who are risk takers advocating for innovation. I think we can agree on that.
No, well, Juan Daniel, it depends. Remember that what many governments have done during COVID-19. Look at Israel, look at Taiwan, look at South Korea. Governments tracking their citizens and tracking the virus. For example, forget about privacy in the 21st century.
But how is privacy and government tracking related to, well, it is innovative.
That's an innovation. It's an innovation to protect citizens from pandemics.
Well, you just opened a big can of worms with the fourth industrial revolution and the role of government and data and the loss of privacy, as we're able to quantify even many more aspects of human society, societal interactions as before. And that's a fascinating topic, which I would like us to discuss, but it will unfortunately have to wait for the next edition because we don't have much time. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I will tell a personal anecdote before we move forward. And I might get in trouble for this, but I hope not. So I was actually at the Web Summit, which is, for those of you who know, it's Europe's currently largest tech conference. It happens once a year in Lisbon, towards the end of the year, and it's between 50,000 to 60,000 participants at the moment for every year. And I was lucky enough to get a private roundtable session with Werner Vogels, who's the CTO of Amazon. And the issue or the topic of conversation with Werner was the future of voice, right? In the context of Amazon's voice products, such as Alexa or the Echo Dot, the voice-enabled commands or voice-enabled assistants. And, he gave his speech and he talked to, the 10, 20 of us who were there. And then towards the end, he said he was open for Q&A. And everybody, took out their cell phones and was recording it. He didn't seem to mind. And when my turn came along, I invented some story, it's a half true story because I used my dad for the story, but in reality it was me. I started noticing myself with my, Amazon Echo Dot that it was recording words and phrases that were not necessarily commands in its log, right? So, given this, which was quite concerning, it was unexpected, at least on my end, I asked Werner while I was recording him and everybody else, Werner, given, that this happened, is the future of voice the death of privacy? And the guy, stared at me in the eye. You were like, three long seconds. I was expecting, some sort of like watered down PR answer. And he said, yes. Next question.
Of course it is.
And I haven't recorded.
Of course, they already use Alexa for a murder crime in Florida 2 years ago or 1 year ago. So yes, of course.
So there is innovation. There is innovation in the public sector, or maybe the public sector working together with the private sector. But
tracking citizens is an innovation. Tracking citizens.
It's true.
Yes. And you don't need that, and that would also have consequences on electoral processes, because why do you need to go to elections once a year if you can know, if you can know with precision the exact opinions of your citizens? I don't know, if you can you can continuously track the preferences of your citizens. They already know who you are going to vote for based on your tweets and your Facebook and your credit card accounts and all your data. So
that's also a topic of conversation for the next one. I wanted to debate, what's the future of society? What's the dystopia we're heading towards? Is it more Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, or is it more 1984, George Orwell? Is it we're going to be controlled by being desensitized to the constant bombardment of information and stimuli, which is Brave New World? Or are we going to be controlled as societies by censorship of information and doublespeak and misinformation? I personally think we're more in a Brave New World kind of context where we just become desensitized to this massive input and stimuli we receive every day. But that's the topic of conversation for next time. Have you read the book?
Biological inequalities. We didn't talk about that. That will happen.
We didn't have time, unfortunately.
I hope we don't leave this, but that will happen most likely.
Well, I do very much intend to continue this in a separate occasion as a series. I think it's been very fascinating discussion, and I think we're all, we all have great opinions, and we all, with our backgrounds as economists, can think about these things for both the macro and the micro perspective. But just to wrap up, I'm just going to briefly say some of the points I wrote down that we were discussing. First of all, we talked about UBI is universal basic income needed to facilitate the transition from labor force that's traditionally more manual labor or manufacturing towards something that's more services based, more higher added value. We talked about the incentive structures that you would need to put in place from both the private sector and the government sector to allow for this transition and this shift that will happen and is happening with increased automatization of supply chain processes. We talked about how maybe not every government would be able to subsidize training or upskilling of its labor force. We also talk about how maybe there's now a loss or there's not that much dependency in the classical office anymore, as we're able to work from home and work from other places with stable internet connections, well, except for Venezuela and Adolfo. But the fourth industrial revolution is going to enable human interaction with the need to be physically meeting and in a reliable and quick way. We talk about how human resilience and adaptability might be the key factor that would allow the shift of the labor force to adapt to the new reality of the new jobs that will be competitive and that will still be existing in the near future. We talked about also how perhaps countries need to really start thinking now or yesterday about where they want to see themselves with regards to adapting labor policy in the future. what changes need to be made, and then start knocking on institutions that could help them finance such initiatives, such as the World Bank and the IMF. We talk about how loss of jobs, even in developed countries, might lead to political instability, jobs that would be lost to countries that are more cost competitive with the same skill sets, and no need for physical barriers impeding, or not need to be physically present in the country that you will be working for. You could do it online. So perhaps the need for labor visas or work permits, or even
or student visas. It almost happened. It almost happened this year. Almost happened.
Or student visas would be as necessary. Innovation in the public sector. We talked about how it's hard to innovate in the public sector due to rigid institutions, perhaps the lack of rewarding incentive structures for individual actors who take the risk to innovate. But at the same time, we do see that governments are innovating, perhaps not in the fields we would want them to innovate, or rather in the fields where they should be focusing most on, such as individual tracking and monitoring of our actions. But that seems to be where the world is headed at the moment. So with that said, gentlemen, we have around a minute left. I want to thank you all personally, Antonio, Rafael, and Adolfo. I think this was pretty fascinating. And I'll be glad to share this as soon as it's available. And we've done some edits, some video edits. So thank you very much. I hope we can continue this as part of a long series. And I look forward to talking to you soon. And the Budapest Hub thanks you as well on my behalf for your participation.